even when you're depressed, like you still have to eat. It's not one of those things in your life that you can drop because you aren't really feeling up to the task. There are lots of things we can turn down or say no to or whatever to help make the load a bit more bearable during those times. And feeding yourself is not one of them. And so that's what I've become more increasingly interested in, is what cooking and eating look like on those days.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the cultural influences around food and how food connects us and sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. We also talk about recipes, cooking tips, and more. This is a space that is dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to the show. I have such a powerful episode for you today, all about cooking and mental health. I speak with Christina Chaey, who is a food writer and recipe developer. She's a former senior food editor at Bon Appétit magazine, where she developed recipes, wrote and edited stories, and starred in their popular YouTube channel. She currently writes the newsletter Gentle Foods on Substack, which is actually where I found her. And one of her newsletters, which she titled On Breaking Up with Perfectionist Cooking, was actually the spark for today's episode. Christina shares her journey with cooking, mental health, and depression, and how those things are kind of intertwined. She discusses how cooking has become a barometer for her to better understand her inner state. She describes how she's had to let go of this performance of perfectionism when it comes to cooking, and instead use cooking as a way to practice the art of meeting herself where she's at, as she explains. We also discuss cooking on low days and how the act of preparing a meal, no matter how simple or non-Instagram worthy it is, can become a small win. And those small wins can have a ripple effect, making even the hardest of days feel possible. Christina describes how she had to shift from a mindset of why am I feeling this way to how can I use cooking in the kitchen as a way to better support myself for where I am right now. She also discusses how she prepares for low days on her good days. And sometimes this is just as simple as stocking her pantry with easy-to-use ingredients. Finally, Christina shares her recent journey of discovering that she's pre-diabetic and what that has meant for her relationship to food and cooking. This is a really deep and powerful episode, and I think you're going to walk away with a better understanding of how you can nourish yourself, not only on low days, which we've all had and which we will all have in the future, but also in general. I think this episode really shows us how we can use cooking as a powerful tool for self-compassion. As always, if this work resonates with you, an easy way that you can support it is leave a comment, share it with your people, rate it over on your podcast app. I know that these things seem really small, but they actually make a huge difference. You can also become a subscriber to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter, where I go deeper into some of these topics. I share weekly recipes, cooking tips, and more. And for just a few bucks a month, you can become a paid member. As a paid subscriber, you have access to all of the recipes, to bonus content, other fun perks, and most importantly, you make this ad-free work possible. It could not happen without community support. And I'm so grateful for all of you paid subscribers. All right, my friends, let's dive into the show. Well, Christina, it is such an honor to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Today, we're going to talk about cooking and mental health, and I can't wait to see where this conversation takes us. But before we dive in, I'm going to ask you the first question that I ask all of my guests. And that is, what is your cultural upbringing and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
So I am Korean American, not technically first generation. I like to call it 1.5 generation. My parents both immigrated to the US when they were young kids. And I've grown up here my whole life. And we lived in suburban New Jersey. That's where they still live. And then I went to college in the Midwest. And then I came back here and started living life in New York. And I think a lot of aspects of just living in suburbia in the 90s probably had the greatest impact on my relationship with food, where I had like a working dad and a mom who was at home and she was cooking meals for us. So we like sat around the table at dinner every night, but also there were lots of messages at the time around dieting and, it's like Jenny Craig and Slim Fast were big at the time and stuff like that. And yeah, those are kind of lasting messages for me that have defined this later relationship that I've started to define rebelling against all of those things.
Yeah, I feel like I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I feel like so much of that is an undoing. It's an undoing of that conditioning that we just were so exposed to and so woven into. What did like dinners look like at home? Were your parents cooking traditional Korean foods, or were they cooking more American style foods, or a mix?
It was kind of a mix. We would probably have traditional Korean food three or four times a week. And then the rest of the week, it would be just totally American. A lot of pasta with jarred Prego sauce that my mom would like chop vegetables and add them to the sauce, and a lot of salmon with rice and broccoli or meatloaf, just like random stuff that feels pretty of the time.
Yeah. And then were you always interested in food? If you could just briefly describe that journey of finding a career in the food industry.
I would say I was moderately interested in food. Like I was really interested in watching food television because, it was the 90s. It was the golden era of food television. I loved watching Martha Stewart make ornate cakes and hors d'oeuvres and all this fancy stuff I would never dream of making at home. And it was so transportive to a place and a feel. And then later when I was in high school, I would religiously come home and watch like the 3:30 to 4:30 programming block on Food Network, which I'm pretty sure it was like Ina Garten and or Giada De Laurentiis and Rachel Ray. It was the afternoon prime time.
Yeah.
But it didn't really translate into a desire to cook stuff in real life. I think probably just because I had other interests and I had other things going on just as a normal kid. And then I went to college, and I would say that's probably where my interest started blooming in earnest. And a lot of it was because the year that my friends and I started living off campus, we all of a sudden had to figure out how to feed ourselves and how to do so on these shoestring budgets. So it was a lot of experimenting that year with figuring out like what we liked. And we had a big Friendsgiving at our house that year, and it was the first time I'd cooked a turkey, and it was like a 20-pound turkey or something crazy. And so that's sort of what I think of in terms of the turning point for when I really became interested. And then when I was in my early 20s, I moved to New York, and I found myself going to work. I was working as a young reporter at a business magazine, and I would find myself coming home at night and spending all my free time on the weekends just cooking, voraciously cooking. And it was so clearly, looking back, just a thing I was doing to escape. It brought me a lot of comfort, and it was also something that I really fell into and was like, oh, this is where I feel right. And so I was very fortunate that I was able to then ultimately make it a career.
Yeah, and move into food media, right? And that was your kind of entryway as far as your career goes?
Yeah, and I got into food media through the media route, I guess I would say, because as I mentioned, I was working as a reporter, and then I ended up getting this temp gig at Bon Appétit maybe like 10 years ago at this point. And it was only supposed to be for a 3-week job, but it ended up that a position was open at the time, and I applied for it and got the position. And then that was how I got my foot in that door.
Yeah. So interesting. This isn't the question I thought I was going to start with, but being in food media myself for many years, you had a recent newsletter, and which is the reason we're talking today, because the title of the newsletter was On Breaking Up with Perfectionist Cooking. And a lot of my listeners know this is a topic that I've spoken about through my own lens. And I found your perspective to be so powerful because you also brought in more of the mental health elements of this discussion. Whereas I've kind of explored perfectionist cooking from this lens of self-worth. And for you and I who've been in food media, as a food stylist, it might seem like, well, yeah, I can understand why you would have this idea of your self-worth being attached to the food you make, because in a way that is our job, and that's somewhat tied to our identity. But I believe that anybody who cooks, we live in this cultural paradigm where food is quote unquote love, and the way we perceive giving love through food, whether you cook for a family or for other people, there's so many nuances and conditioning around this idea of our worth being tied to the foods and to the meals that we create. When it comes to perfectionism and cooking, where is that woven together for you, this idea of perfectionism, self-worth, and cooking?
This is something that I've thought about for many years. And I think that for me, a lot of what I learned in my years working in media and a very specific niche of food media instilled a lot of beliefs in me about how cooking was to be done and performed. And it's like not a secret. I worked at Bon Appétit, and there was such a sense of how things were done. And there was a way that things were done right. And there was a way that everything else was done. And we were the ones who did things right because we served wine at the dinner party in buckets of ice from like reclaimed metals or something. And we didn't do courses. We did like whatever it was. I could think of a million examples, but these things, when you're young and you're trying to make it in a field that you've wanted to be in forever, there becomes this incredible amount of pressure to perform and do the group think and all that stuff. And I don't think that's actually all that unique to food or food media. What I do think, I guess, is unique about it is that we partake in food and cooking outside of our jobs for most of us, right? Like, including people who work in food. And so there wasn't really a lot of separation for me between what I was working on and performing in the job and what I was enacting in my home life, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden it becomes like, well, if I'm ever having someone over, it's got to look like this. Or if I'm ever baking a pie, it's got to look like this, or, whatever it is. And so in that way, cooking for me for many years became another expression of performing perfectionism.
Yeah, I resonate so deeply with that, to the point where I started to hate having people over because I put so much pressure on myself. Like, it has to be.
I'm going through that right now. I'm like, nobody come over.
I completely get it. And it wasn't until, for me, COVID, and we were forced to stop having people over. And then I had to have this like talk with my best friends and be like, I just don't have it in me to cook for people anymore. And they were like, all right, let's just order takeout and hang out. And I was like, wait, you guys don't care? But it's really real.
Yeah, I'm going through that exact same thing right now. And it's totally unsurprising that our friends would be like, that's cool. Like, you don't have to cook. No one said you have to cook, girl. And I was like, oh, right. It's about the other stuff. It's about the like hanging out and the quality time stuff. I don't know how it felt for you adopting that and where you were prior in terms of how you related to cooking for other people and hosting and stuff. But I've found a lot more peace and freedom recently with just letting go of a lot of that stuff. One thing I feel like I've eased up a lot more in terms of like performing, entertaining, if you will, is I used to be really bad at delegating because I didn't want people to get quote unquote like the wrong thing. And I have this memory of maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had asked in a rare moment of delegation, I had asked a friend to bring some charcuterie or something to a dinner that I was having. And they showed up and I didn't serve the salami that they got because I was like, oh, they got the wrong salami. Which is just an insane thing in retrospect. But that's how bad the control stuff was. And that felt so normal to me at the time, when now I just think that's absolutely bonkers.
Oh, I think that word, you just like hit the nail on the head for me, that word control. And it is a scary thing to start to relinquish control, whether that is like for me, like the control of I wanted everyone to come. I wanted all of the food to be prepped. I wanted, all of a sudden people are just there and it's so easy. And like little did they know, like 5 minutes before they came, I was like running around the house, cleaning up, barking at my husband and like telling the kids not to eat the hors d'oeuvres and stuff. And it's like, I was trying to control this scene, perform this scene. And really it was like in just letting that control go and be like, let it be wild and messy and imperfect and store-bought when it needs to be store-bought. That was a big shift for me as well. But I think letting go of this need to control the meal in what I perceive to be good and bad, break down that duality for myself a little bit and have more fun.
And I think in terms of control too, like there's control stuff that's externally directed, for example, the weird stuff I just talked about with the dinner parties. And then I think there's a much more, I'm not sure what the word is, like there's a much more insidious maybe version of it where the control is directed internally.
Yeah.
And that becomes a lot more intense and it becomes a lot harder, I think, to talk about because no one sees that.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways that can feel almost like a comfort. It's like if no one can see it, no one can sort of have a say or pass judgment, or, it can just be this place away from everything and everyone. And that's, just to bring it back to the perfectionism thing, I think that's how I have felt about a lot of my control stuff that's like self-directed, where I just think, if I'm going to cook, it's got to look a certain way. Yeah. It's got to be a certain kind of thing. I think what I was trying to do in that process was I was trying to control my moods or something. I was trying to control for the kind of person that I thought I had to be all the time, which was just, with it, on it, like happy, productive, whatever. And that's just not how people are 100% of the time. No one's like that 100% of the time. And so why am I putting such a limited set of parameters around a kind of cooking that I would deem worthwhile or worthy?
So this is the perfect segue into today's conversation about cooking and mental health. In your recent newsletter, you said that many people talk about the joys of cooking on the good days, as you just kind of described. Like we all want to be that person who's cooking because it makes them feel so sensual and alive. And there's truth to that. And sometimes we do feel that way. But as humans, we don't always feel that way. We are going to have days when we're down and we're low. You say fewer people talk about cooking on the bad days, specifically why it's worth cooking at all when you're having trouble finding the will to get dressed in the morning. In your opinion, can you just talk about this a little bit more and why you would want to cook at all?
Yes. And something that I think is tied in that same paragraph is the idea of like, wanting to cook and not just like ordering takeout.
Yeah.
And nothing is inherently wrong with ordering takeout, and sometimes that is what I need. But I think what I'm learning more and more about what I need when I'm not in a good place mentally is I need something that's going to make me feel like I've had a small win. For me, those small wins are most accomplishable in the kitchen, just because that is where I feel competent.
Mm.
And those small wins in the kitchen have this runoff effect of making more of life feel more possible,
Mm.
which is like the most important thing. It's making me emotional right now to talk about, but I think you just like, when you're having bad days, you just want to feel like more of life is possible. And sorry, did not
Please
plan to or want to.
don't be sorry. I think that what you're saying is hitting the heart of so many people who experience depression regularly and those who experience depression intermittently. We all do. That idea of a small win becomes a catalyst for, as you just said, possibility. And for you, that happens in the kitchen.
And it might not be the case that that happens for everyone in the kitchen, because not everyone has the same like lived experience as I do. But what's interesting to me about mental health and cooking and like that intersection is that even when you're depressed, like you still have to eat. It's not one of those things in your life that you can drop because you aren't really feeling up to the task. There are lots of things we can turn down or say no to or whatever to help make the load a bit more bearable during those times. And feeding yourself is not one of them. And so that's what I've become more increasingly interested in, is what cooking and eating look like on those days.
Another thing that you talk about is how to plan for the days when perhaps you might not be feeling so great by doing the things on the days that where you do feel great, to plan for those days where you might not be feeling so great. What does that look like?
A lot of what that looks like for me actually is just shopping for the right things, like making sure that things that are appropriate for a lower energy level or lower level of motivation are available to me and at home when I need them. Because when I'm in those moments, like I'm not going to the store to get the things, you know? And so a lot of that is just, for me, it's like cans of beans and quick cooking lentils, tofu, things like that. And then the other part of it, I would say, is when I am feeling good and I do feel like I have the energy and desire, that maybe I take on some kind of project that's going to be something I dip into in the future. Like maybe that's the time when I make a batch of stock and then I use it for something now, but I freeze most of it later, and I'll freeze it in pint containers or quart containers. And then all I really have to do is dump it into a pot and heat it up and throw some vegetables or something in it on a day when I'm not really feeling so up to the task.
You had a quote that I want to share that I really love. You said, it's a shift from why am I feeling this way? Why can't I do this? To I'm not okay. What is the choice I want to make in the kitchen that will support me right now? Can you talk about this?
The thing that comes to mind for me is so many memories of embarking on cooking tasks or projects that were just so not appropriate for the level or the place that I was at in the time. And I just either made myself push through them and do it anyway and wouldn't feel any better. I'm talking about, just like maybe I had plans to host 6 people for dinner, or maybe I was going to make like some sort of laminated pastry or something, whatever. And in my opinion, that's not an appropriate task to set for yourself, like where the bar is set so high when your current bar is like not there. And to me, the critical part of that quote is the question of why. The why am I feeling this way? And that is something that I am working really hard on right now to shift away from, because I'm coming around to the idea that it doesn't really matter what the why is. It just matters that this is where you're at right now. Knowing why isn't going to make me not feel this way. It's not going to be able to prevent it from happening in the future, because we're talking about like moods. And again, these are not things that we can control. But something that I talk about this with my therapist a lot is like, you can't control them, but you can do things to promote regulation. So maybe instead of being like, I'm going to make lasagna with bechamel and bolognese from scratch and whatever, maybe you just don't do that. Maybe you wait for another time when you're feeling more up for that. And maybe for now you do something like, I don't know, maybe it is that you order takeout, or maybe it is that you make something that's just, I write about this thing called depression salad sometimes, where it's just like the thing at the store where you buy the packaged everything, and that's just the thing that you need in that moment, and it gets you fed. And again, it just comes back to like, you did this thing for yourself, right? You did this one good thing for yourself, and now it feels good to have accomplished that. And now I have that win.
It's interesting because, I'm working on a book that's coming out in 2026. And so much of the concept of the book is like how we nourish ourselves. And it's not just about the recipe that you make or the thing that ends up on your plate. It's that intention behind it. So like you said, sometimes that means ditching our plans. If you had these plans to make this meal and that was the meal you were going to make, and in your body, making that meal is going to deplete you. It's really hard sometimes to admit that and to make that shift and to do the thing that's more supportive. Whether that is I love that idea of a depression salad, of buying all the things, but then you put them in a bowl and you make it your own, or ordering takeout. But what is the most nourishing thing? What is actually going to be supportive in this instance? And as you say, cooking, therefore, can become this tool to understand where we're at. It's not like cooking is going to be the fixer, but it actually becomes the navigational tool to be like, oh, let's see where I'm at today and how can I best support that?
Yeah. And I really love that. I refer to that as my best internal barometer. And I totally agree. I generally find now that when I take a moment and consider how I'm feeling toward cooking, whether it's something specific or just at all in a given day, that's a real clue for me in terms of what's going on inside, and like how I am relating to it in that given day is evidence, I guess, for whether I need to be, changing my plans and pulling back a bit, whether I need to, be taking a couple other things that are not cooking related off my plate, like maybe an appointment or a hang or something. And in that way, my attitude toward cooking helps me to figure out like all the other places in my life where I struggle to shed and to say no and to just like pull back from things, because that's just how I was socialized.
Yeah, all of us, right? And it goes back to that idea of worth sometimes, because we feel like we have to do all those things to prove that we are worthy, forgetting that our worth has nothing to do with any of these external activities or productivity or any of those, anything. Actually, our worth has nothing to do with anything. It just is.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the point isn't to do away with depression, but rather to become inclusive and supportive of all of the days. And I think that's such a beautiful shift, because it allows for this inclusivity of all emotions. And it doesn't pit one thing as bad and one thing as good. It's just all going to show up. Can you talk a little bit more about this idea of inclusivity with your mental state?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's just an exercise in self-compassion, which I think is sort of the forever work that I want to embark on within my in my own relationship to myself. And it goes back, I think, to what we were just talking about, what are the things I can do to support myself where I am now, and instead of being like, why do I feel this way? Or, making
Yeah.
myself feel bad for feeling this way or whatever,
Yeah.
to just accept is a radical act.
Mm.
And I think, yeah, these moments where you just decide you're going to like make a snack plate for dinner or whatever, I don't really know that I would call it a radical act maybe, but it is just a way of being like, hey, I don't feel great and I still deserve something nice.
I just got chills. Yeah. Yeah. I think that is actually a radical act for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you're not feeling great, it's really easy, at least for me, like my experience of perfectionism and depression and stuff is that when I don't feel great, it becomes a blanket statement on just who I am and who I've always been and who I'm always going to be. Like there's no forward thinking, there's no hindsight. There's just this present thought of like, I am bad. That persists. And then I think it's really easy to feel like then you don't deserve the nice thing.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
Yeah. And cooking can be a way to give yourself something really nice, even if it's just a bowl of yogurt with some berries sprinkled on top.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the something nice does not look like what I thought it would look like. It doesn't look like something you would necessarily want to post on Instagram or text a photo to someone about. It doesn't look like anything I thought it was supposed to look like. And that is really, it's just kind of interesting.
Do you mind, you shared in our email exchange that you found out earlier this year that you're pre-diabetic and that this has also influenced how you feed yourself. Would you mind sharing a bit about that journey?
So, yeah, like I mentioned in our emails, that diagnosis has become a really important inflection point for me in my own cooking life. And it was, it was upsetting in a lot of ways. And the experience of the appointment where I found this out was upsetting in a lot of ways because I went to this doctor who I hadn't seen before because I was in the process of finding a new PCP. And she did the test. She sent me a message that I found very unhelpful, which was just like, here's what you have to do: reduce sweets, bread, rice, potatoes, corn, do more cardio, like lose weight, come back in 3 months, goodbye. And I was just like, well, okay. Not going to do that.
No.
And so instead, I was really intent on finding more sustainable paths because I've been down this road of thinking before. I've been down the road of restriction and all that stuff. And it's just like it's just crap. And crap for your mental health too.
Yes.
And so I ended up finding this incredible, like diabetes and pre-diabetes specific nutrition, what would you call it? Company, agency, service called Diabetes Digital, which has been written about by, some people who I think you've had on your podcast, like Virginia Soul Smith and Julia Turshen's written about them. And their work is really, really inspiring to me because it's really about helping people to enjoy, in particular, like culturally relevant foods while still achieving their desired health goals, like whatever those things might be. And stuff like that, like highlighting culturally relevant foods is such a rare thing to find in that space because it can just so often be blanket, like,
Yeah.
just like reduce carbs and like eat Mediterranean or whatever that means.
Right.
I know Andrea and Wynn has thoughts on that too.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so I started working with this really incredible dietitian there. And within 2 sessions of meeting with her, I realized that I just like had been trying to ask her all of these questions like, well, can I eat this? Like, can I eat birthday cake at this? What if there's a birthday and there's no like nuts to eat with the cake to balance out the blood sugar? Or what if I'm on a road trip and we have to eat something, but there's only gas station food? Or, I had all of these questions and I thought, there were all these different scenarios when in reality, I was just trying to figure out the answer to this one central question of like, is it going to be okay? And I really credit her with helping me to understand that like it is going to be okay. And there's not one way to achieving your health goals. Like you don't have to do the things that this doctor said. Like you have these other choices. And yeah, I don't know. It was just it was an interesting time because all of this like good food, bad food stuff that I had been working for so long to get away from kind of came roaring back after that diagnosis. And all of a sudden I was really fretting about like every carbohydrate and its quality.
This kind of is like full circle to where we started growing up in the 90s, that diet culture restriction, it's real. And so it's really interesting to be faced with something like this. And just to share a little bit of my own story, after my oldest daughter was born, I came down with a series of thyroid issues, ended up I had to cut gluten out of my diet, and I felt just the way you're feeling. I was like kind of faced with all of this jargon of what I should and shouldn't be eating. And it actually ended up being an incredibly healing time because it became a very empowering time where I got to find out for myself what worked. And it was the first time I learned to trust myself over the guidance, even of doctors. Even though I had doctors helping me, it was the first time I gave myself the space to feel into what was working for me, regardless of what I was being told. And that's, not the path I would recommend to get out of diet culture thinking, but for some it is, for some of us being faced with these health issues. Well, my last podcast was with Julia Scarpaleggia, and she just had to cut dairy out of her diet as an Italian who loves cheese. And it's the same thing. It's like these moments can, in hindsight, become really empowering, but it does take us owning our own health and not being swayed by, some kind of doctors or protocols or numbers. All of that stuff has a place, but at the end of the day, we know our bodies, better than any of these other external things do.
I also know my mind, it's like, frankly, I'm sure that doctor was right. I'm sure if I stopped eating dessert and bread and rice and potatoes and corn, like, sure, I'm sure something would happen as a result of that. But really, it's just a question of like whatever those like positive gains are, is that worth whatever mental repercussions are going to come out of it? For me, like the answer is so clearly no.
It's so clearly no. And I would push back and say, and it's not the only way. And it's not the only way.
Yeah, it's hard, I think, because they're doctors, they're people who like have been trained and who have like such a place of authority in our culture. And in many ways, like obviously for good reason, but at the same time, to your point, like there is more than one way. And so it's just kind of, I wish there were a way that more of that message were getting communicated in those conversations,
Yeah.
And why I'm really grateful for people like my dietitian who I worked with at Diabetes Digital, where it was just like,
amazing.
You don't have to stop eating rice.
Yeah.
That'd be crazy.
Christina, I am so grateful for your sharing your story today and really going deep, being vulnerable in this space. I have no doubt that this conversation is going to really impact so many people who listen. I know it has me just in speaking with you. I want to ask you one more question, and this has nothing to do with anything we've just talked about. This is a fun one. It's the last question I ask all of my guests, and it's your last meal on earth. What would it be?
Last meal on earth probably would be like a really good cheeseburger with extra pickles and really good fries and a cold martini.
Oh, yes.
My forever dream.
That is the perfect dream. Thank you again. I really, really value this conversation, and I wish you the best of luck in your journey.
Thank you, and good luck with your book. I'm so excited to read it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.